In 1943, the Zoot Suit riots were performed against Spanish Americans by American servicemen stationed in Los Angeles as well as native LA citizens. The initial attack that would lead to riots and attack mobs forming occurred when a group of 11 sailors got off their bus to start walking through downtown Los Angeles. The sailors claimed they were jumped by a gang of Mexican American men in Zoot Suits on Main Street. The Zoot Suit wearing men claimed the sailors started it and they were acting in self-defense. Personally, if I believe either side of the story, I like to believe the sailors started some shit and got their asses kicked by the Zoot Suit wearing men and were too afraid to admit it. After this attack, the LAPD reported to the scene to assess the situation. Not only did the LAPD go to see what was happening, a group who named themselves the Vengeance Squad decided it was their duty to aid the officers in the raiding of Zoot Suit men. The officers said they went to the scene to, quote, clean up Main Street from what was viewed as the loathsome influences Pachuco gangs. I hope I pronounced that right. There was also a fairly common belief that Zoot Suits were deemed unconstitutional because of the amount of material it would take to produce one during a time of war. In just the very next day, 200 sailors would head for East Los Angeles, which had a large Mexican American population. Once the sailors spotted a group of younger people sporting Zoot Suits, they assaulted them with clubs, then briefly after stripped the boys of the Zoot Suits and burned the clothing in a pile. Burning the clothing when the groups are working in a form of protesting the overuse of fabrics during World War II sounds ridiculously counterproductive, but the men would continue to attack and strip people of their clothing. Once the situation gained more media coverage, the group of sailors and other white angry people would grow, leading to more attacks and civil unrest. The attacks would continue to spread until thousands of citizens and other servicemen had joined in on the attacks, now marching down Los Angeles streets, going into taverns and bars and other common places while assaulting the young Mexican Americans. There was one instance where two Zoot Suit wearing men were dragged onto a stage in a theater, then stripped of their clothing, and the clothing would be urinated on by the sailors. Over the next few days, 150 people would be injured, with 500 Latino citizens being arrested or charged with charges ranging from rioting to vagrancy. The very large mob of aggressors was now pushing through streets as a group, pulling people of color out of their cars and beating them, as well as any Filipinos and Mexican Americans they cited, pretty much any minority group that they ran into. The press coverage of the event would state that it had a cleansing effect and helped get rid of hoodlums, and the sailors and white Americans were lauded. Finally, the Los Angeles City Council would approve what they decided was a resolution, and this being to criminalize the wearing of Zoot Suits within LA city limits. Councilman Norris Nelson stated the Zoot Suit has become a badge of hoodlumism. Finally, on June 8th of 1943, after 5 days of brutal attacks against Mexican Americans, people of color, etc., the United States Navy and Marine Corps would call for all military personnel to report to their barracks and declared Los Angeles off limits to military personnel. The attacks would be decided they were all an act of self-defense by the Navy shore personnel. After the attacks, the State Un-American Activities Committee would arrive in LA to determine whether the present Zoot Suit riots were sponsored by Nazi agencies attempting to spread the disunity between the US and Latin American countries. This was a possibility due to the Americans thinking their trades with Latin America were being sabotaged during the time of war. And many civil rights activists would become inspired by the Zoot Suit riots. Somewhat interestingly, Malcolm X would wear a Zoot Suit and later became a political activist. That's all I've got. Thank you for watching.